and welcome to this John Schofield Trust Sports Journalism Masterclass. I hope you'll enjoy the next hour. I also hope you'll get quite a lot out of it, and you'll be doing that thanks to a great panel we've got this evening, who I'm going to introduce you to now, for those of you who don't know them, and I imagine that's very few of you. But first of all, Sally Nugent from BBC Breakfast. A little bit of background about Sally. I hope she doesn't get too embarrassed about me giving her life history now, but she was born and raised in the Wirral. I'm not quite sure what you say really, actually, but she studied French at uni, then took an NCTJ course at Liverpool. Her first job was at Radio Merseyside, and then she moved to BBC Northwest Television. Then from there, she went down to London to Network News as a news correspondent or a news reporter for a time, and then was one of the first journalists to move straight back up north as soon as BBC Sport and BBC Breakfast was launched up there or moved up there. As BBC's breakfast sports presenter since then, of course, she's done all the major stories over the years, from Olympics to World Cups. And in the last year, I'm sure you all have seen, she's done some brilliant work, particularly with Marcus Rashford's Free School Meals campaign. And she's also focused on sportsmen with MND, footballers who've suffered dementia. But most impressively of all that, she gets up before 4 o'clock in the morning.
This is true.
Dharmesh Sheth is our next panelist. Dharmesh began as a freelancer for newspapers and magazines. Then he got his first full-time role at ITV Sport as an editorial assistant. From then, I think more or less, Dharmesh, on sort of launch time, you joined Sky Sports News as a sub-editor, and then 3 years after that, and you must have done a decent job, you were offered the job of a reporter, and you've never looked back since. You've been doing it ever since. You're also doing some presenting on Sky Sports News and on Sky News, and you're also a regular on Sky Sports Transfer Talk podcast. Obviously, Transfer Talk is something that Sky News, Sky Sports News is very well renowned for. And then finally, Nick Powell, twice an RTS award winner, he tells me, been at Sky for 25 years now, 10 of those as Sky News' sports editor. Like Sally, he hails from the Northwest. Like Sally, he started in local radio, Pennine Radio News, I believe, before getting a job at Yorkshire TV. His best working evening, he says, was Super Saturday at the London Olympics in 2012. His best afternoon, Andy Murray, the year after winning Wimbledon. He also speaks German and Russian, but hopefully he won't be doing too much of that tonight. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's very kind of you to give up your time. The John Schofield Trust, by the way, as you all know, is a charity, and all the masterclasses the Trust runs are free. If you're able to make a donation to support the work of the Trust, which I would highly recommend, then please click on the QR code, which is on the screen now. We'd very much appreciate that. Thank you very much. Now, we'll start the discussion off in a second, but of course, you'll all be familiar with the way these things work, these virtual events work. So please, if you've got any questions, I'll try and get to them, as many of them as I can, but just use the Q&A box and we'll do our best to ask the questions. Well, so let's start with how it all began for our panelists, because I gave you a sort of a brief introduction to how their careers got underway, but I know a lot of you will be really fascinated to know whether it was down to hard work, a bit of luck, a bit of both. So Sally, with you, how did you go from doing your degree, which wasn't a journalism degree, first off, deciding to get into journalism, and then making a go of it and getting a break in it?
Well, I think I had probably always secretly wanted to be a journalist, probably since I was like 12 or 13, but had never been really brave enough to say it out loud, because it seemed like one of those unattainable jobs that, I don't know, it didn't seem like I could ever really achieve that, even though in the back of my head I always wanted to do it. So it had always been there. And all the way through my degree, I suppose I did a French degree, but with different bits of sections that I could study other things. And I always did anything to do with communication or media, that sort of thing. And that's what I studied when I went to France, to university there. I did like a kind of a media module over there. And so I'd always had one eye on it. And then I finished my degree and wasn't really grown up enough to make that step, or brave enough to go and ask for work experience anywhere. So what I miss out from my bio, what you won't read, is I fiddled about for a bit. I spent, I think, 2 years working as a temp. I'd done shorthand at school. And so I knew I had basic secretarial skills. So I worked for a temp agency, and I went around all these, different places. I learned how to work in an office. I learned how to use an old-fashioned switchboard. I learned how to use a very old-fashioned piece of equipment called a photocopier, a fax machine, all of these things. Saved up enough money and eventually managed to get a place on an NCTJ course, and managed to start doing some work experience in local radio. And the thing that happened to me then was, because I went into local radio, and lots and lots of people, BBC, local radio is a great place for work experience, and lots of very clever, very talented people go in and try and get their first job there. And I wasn't the cleverest, and I definitely wasn't the most talented, but what I could do was I could use a switchboard, use a photocopier, and I knew how to send a fax. So they all thought I was really clever. So I could do all the practical stuff that perhaps all the other people who had just been studying hadn't learned yet. So they really liked me, and I did a few weeks work experience there, finished my course, got my qualification. And the news editor at Radio Merseyside, I'll never forget it, she phoned me up the day I finished, and she said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And I was like, "Oh, nothing." And she said, "Well, come in, I've got a shift for you." She gave me 2 shifts that week, 2 shifts the next week, for money, being paid. And then there was a bit of a break. And then, bit by bit, I got like a couple of weeks, then a little contract, and eventually got a staff job and loved it. And the difficulty was, my dream had always been like a broadcast journalist job in local radio. And I couldn't quite believe it when I got it, because I didn't really know what to do next. So that's how I got in. A lot of luck, and maybe not necessarily being the cleverest, but just being able to do practical things.
Yeah, being useful. I think being useful all round is a very useful skill to have, isn't it? Nick, your first big job was in radio too.
Yeah, this is going to sound scarily similar to Sally. And she went to school, I've just discovered, about 2 miles from where I grew up. But that's that aside, I wanted to be a journalist from about the age of 8, when I stopped wanting to drive trains. And kind of similar to Sally, people did know, people who knew me well knew I wanted to do it, but my mum and dad weren't very encouraging. They said I wasn't pushy enough, and I wasn't sure myself if I was pushy enough. Still not sure, really. So again, like Sally, I did a language degree at university. I did German and Russian at Bradford. I suppose my lucky break was that Bradford University started its university radio station in my final year. So while everybody else was playing discs, which we did do on our show, which was called Thank God It's Friday, long before Chris Evans thought that'd be a good idea for a title. So we interviewed people, and we got an interview with Edward Heath when he was, I think he'd recently been Prime Minister, wasn't still Prime Minister. We got the interview in Radio Leeds, BBC Radio Leeds, didn't get it. So that was great grounding. Without that, I probably wouldn't have got the journalism course place that I got in Cardiff, which was and is a great place to study journalism. I'm sure lots of people listening here will know all about that. And again, like Sally, I know this sounds a bit scary, but I also did. I mean, why wouldn't you? I focused on media stuff in my year abroad. So I did my dissertation on the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is sort of the equivalent of the Guardian, if you like. Made some contacts there, learned a lot there. And then when it came to placement time at Easter on my Cardiff course, in those days, unlike now, you could pretty much choose where you wanted to go. I thought, well, I'll go to Bradford because I know Bradford and I'll be far more use in a city where I know that I'll land. If they say go and interview the councillors at City Hall, I know where that is without asking. So I did okay. I was asked to actually read the news at the very end of my placement, and they rang me up about 6 weeks later and said, would you like a job, because they got rid of somebody. So that's kind of how it started for me, Steve.
That's amazing. So yeah, I mean, I started off in radio as well, and my real break was I just gone in for a few days work experience. I just picked up the phone and spoken to someone, and they said, yeah, come in, have a look around the newsroom. And it turned out after a couple of days that the head of HR thought I was a friend of the news editor, and the news editor thought I was a friend of the head of HR, and they never got rid of me, and I just stayed there until eventually a job came along. Dharmesh, what about you? It sounds like you had to work a lot harder to get your, if I take it the right way, but to get your break, because you were freelancing, and that can be quite a scary place.
Well, I mean, hello everyone, by the way. First of all, I will say Nick Powell is still quite pushy. I work with him, and I don't know how to use a photocopier still. But I've always wanted to be a sports reporter. So I made a decision when I was going to do my degree, whether to do something directly related to journalism or the media, or do something that I could fall back on if it didn't work out because of how competitive it was. So I ended up doing an economics degree. And then after that, I did an MSc in media communication, which I thought would help me. But stupidly, it was an MSc and not an MA. There was no practical element involved in it at all. So I basically just did that year to get the qualification. But the dissertation, we could choose anything we wanted to write about. So I said, right, I will write about, and you will notice the irony in this, I wrote about the impact the new Sky Sports football deal would have on small clubs. Thankfully, none of my employers have actually read that dissertation because I'm now working there. But one of the big breaks I got there was a colleague of mine on the course was a journalist for the Wall Street Journal and a sports journalist. He'd covered the '94 World Cup, but he had now switched out of journalism and was doing a psychology degree. And he was asking me what I was doing my dissertation on. So I explained, and he said, you know what, if you made that into a 1,000-word piece, I think I could get it published in the Wall Street Journal. I'm like, wow, okay. So he set me up with an interview with the FA chief executive at the time, Graham Kelly. So there I was at the FA headquarters with the guy from the course and Graham Kelly sitting in front of me, doing an interview, wrote up this 1,000-word piece, and lo and behold, the week after, he got it published in the Wall Street Journal. In return, I helped him with his stats because he didn't understand the Poisson distribution on one of our courses, and I was a bit of a whiz at that. And then, like you said, freelancing wise, I basically gave myself 1 year to try and become a sports journalist after I finished my master's. And I effectively just wrote to sports people. So I typed out a letter, gave myself the name of the Offside Sports Agency, which I don't even know whether it existed at the time, but I just said I was. And I said, I would write, for example, Dear Les Ferdinand, I would welcome the opportunity to interview you. Already 3 publications are interested in the piece. They weren't, of course, but I just said they were. I typed out this letter, put it in a windowed envelope so it looked official, put another slip into that envelope with my address on it, and then another form that said I cannot do the interview, date, time, and place. And within 2 weeks, it was like waiting for exam results. These letters would start coming back through the post. And I managed to get about 50 odd interviews through that method miraculously, and got about 40 pieces in print. So now I was building up a portfolio, but it's coming towards the end of that year and I still didn't have a job. Kept looking in the Guardian's media section every Monday for the jobs, and was really focusing on trying to get a job as a sports journalist on a newspaper. And then ITV Sport were advertising for editorial assistants. And I was like, never even thought about TV. And I just thought, you know what? It's a foot in the door if I can get something like that. Applied for it, amazingly got the job. And I did that for a year. And then I interviewed for a reporter's job at Sky Sports News. As soon as I sat down, the gentleman interviewing me said, this is not for a reporter. So I was like, oh, what's this for then? And he said, it's for a sub-editor. In my head, I was thinking, what the hell is a sub-editor? But I said, yeah, fine, that's cool. Did the interview, got the job, and was a sub-editor at Sky Sports News for 3 years, and then eventually got the chance to become a reporter, and been doing that since.
Well, that's quite interesting. I mean, you certainly deserved your break with the initiative you showed, but it's quite interesting that your pathway. Would you say, and I'll throw it open to the other two as well, that actually, because this industry is so competitive, you should take whatever break you're given, whatever opportunities arisen, and then try and progress to what you want to do from there? Or should you wait until the right opportunity comes up?
Does anyone want to answer that? I mean, personally, I would say grab any opportunity that you can. And when you have that opportunity, is what you do with it. I describe it as getting your foot in the door, and then how you wiggle your toe when your foot's in the door is the key. So I would say grab any opportunity you can.
Yeah, Nick, Sally, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Same. Yeah, completely. Say yes to everything. Say yes to everything. Say yes to things that you're not sure about. I can remember covering in local radio. I did a whole series of weddings that I covered, quirky weddings. And I remember thinking, this is not what I really wanted to do with my life. But you know what? It was fantastic. And I met amazing people. So yeah, say yes to stuff. My first break into sport was a 6-week, kind of like a little 6-week temporary fill-in thing for someone who'd had to go off temporarily. And I can remember walking into my boss's office in local telly and saying, I could do this for 6 weeks, thinking in my head, I could do this for a lot longer. And she was like, oh, I suppose, yeah, okay, go on then, go on. And of course, I didn't ever go back to my old job. I carried on doing it forever. So yeah, say yes to everything.
Yeah, especially in the early days, which is what we're talking about here. And once you've got a few more miles under your belt, then you can afford to pick and choose a little bit. But in the early days, yeah, absolutely, grab it.
The questions are coming in, and thank you everyone. And I'm gonna merge one now from Jay and from Tim. Jay's asking how important we all think having an NCTJ qualification is now, and Tim is saying, is the industry more competitive, do we think, or actually is there more options open to people now because of the explosion of the digital media landscape? Nick, what do you think about the first of all, the NCTJ qualification?
Well, to take the second bit first, if I may, Steve, I'd say yes and yes to those. Yes, it's more competitive because there are so many more people studying journalism, wanting to be journalism, coming into it from various angles. When I did that course in Cardiff, there were 25 of us. We were housed in a semi-detached, may have been detached house on Cathedral Road in Cardiff, number 34. 25 of us. That was it. That was the Cardiff Journalism School. That was it. These days, there are hundreds of undergraduates, postgraduates, you name it. That's the explosion that there is. But as you say, Steve, there are so many more opportunities, blogs, YouTube, podcasts, you name it. So that's the second part of it. NCTJ, certainly, I can only speak from the Sky point of view. We still value, I don't know whether Dharmesh, whether we still insist on it. We certainly, up until very, very recently, pretty much insisted on it for anybody coming in at the kind of ground level and to some extent above that as well. Still very important.
Yeah, I think Sky, I don't know whether they insist on it, but they want students to be doing some sort of media related or journalism related degree. With regard to the competitiveness, I just echo what Nick says, but also when you have that many people, I just think there's more opportunities as well with all of the different media that you can get involved in, because you don't have to limit yourself to, right, I want to be a broadcast journalist, I want to be a print journalist. Like when I started Sky Sports News, I was like, right, I'm going to be a broadcast journalist. I don't class myself as that anymore, really, because I'm doing stuff for the website now as well. I'm doing stuff for social media. So it's only a part of the job that you end up doing. So even if you are starting in a website or you're starting in front of camera, there's still overlaps that you can do both things still.
Just one more point before Sally comes in on the NCTJ thing. It hasn't just applied at Sky Sports News to new entrants to begin. It's also applied to people who, okay, will be new entrants, but coming from professional sport. There've been people who've done a bit of telly, having been professional sportsmen, and thought, well, I could be a Sky Sports News presenter. And we've said to them, yeah, once you show you've got some journalistic qualifications, you can.
I suppose, Sally, part of this is, getting into the industry in the first place, because it's so competitive, you have to stand out. You have to be different to the next person. And if you've got an NCTJ qualification, clearly that's going to help, isn't it? If you're pitched against someone who hasn't got one.
Yeah, I know it's a really long time ago, but for me, it's certainly what opened the door for me. I wouldn't have got in without mine. I do think things have changed slightly. And in the BBC, I'm sure it's the same at Sky and ITV, but at the BBC now, there are lots of schemes that you can apply for to go and even just do work experience at various BBC places across the country. But the thing that I slightly worry about with those is it's really hard to stand out on a form. You know, if you're just filling in a form and sending it in, I think it is difficult. And the other thing I would say is, you know, anyone with a phone is a journalist now. And the young people that I see coming through have probably been vlogging or blogging or posting for years about things that interest them. And they have that kind of, you know, that body of work behind them that you can see straight away because it's on social media. They've probably got their own YouTube channel. So I do think you have to be braver in a way. I'm not sure at like 23, 24, I would have been brave enough to put myself out there. So I do think it's really tough.
Nick, well, I mean, you must have people coming to you, the sports editor, all the time. What advice would you have to those people about how they pitch ideas to you, how they pitch their stories to you, how they present themselves, what they need to impress you, to give you the opinion that, you know, maybe this is a person, A, I like their ideas, but B, I can see them having a career here?
Well, it's two different things. So pitching I don't generally get people pitching an idea and trying to pitch themselves at the same time. Sure, it does happen. Just doesn't particularly happen to me. So on the idea front, you get so many of those. So the key is, I mean, it's basic, but you'd be amazed. Well, you wouldn't be amazed, Steve. We all know this, but out there you might be amazed how many presumably well-paid, presumably experienced, intelligent professionals send us absolute guff. It's got to be targeted. It's got to. If it's clear to me that this person doesn't even know what branch of the media I'm in, I take a lot of persuading to go beyond the first 4 words. So I want to know by the end of the first sentence, what is in it for me? What are they offering me? And what's the idea? And you'd be astonished how often you have to go to the very bottom to find out, yes, this person at the center of this is available for interview or is not. Make it targeted, make it sound like you know who you're writing to without saying, dear Nick, I hope you're having a nice day. I know you care whether I'm having a nice day, so please don't say that. I've never met you. Don't say that. It's really off-putting. Some people say, I really hope you had a great weekend. You don't. So don't say it. It does not work. It really, it has the opposite effect. And I can kind of tell from Sally not even saying anything.
No, exactly. The same happens to me. I get people saying to me, dear Scott, I love the work that you do.
Yes.
Oh, really? You really know me very well indeed.
But the other thing is about if you're trying to sell yourself as a potential employee, I well remember, I always tell this example these days, people used to apply to us for work experience on the old Sky News Sports Desk when it existed as a separate entity. I won't bore you with the ins and outs of how Sky Sports News works now. And we at Sky Sports News supply Sky News and sports publicists, to put it briefly. But going back a few years, there was an application for someone to do a 3-week or 2-week placement. And this applicant had, by the age of presumably about 19, 20, had already worked in some form or other for The Guardian, BBC World Service, BBC Regional TV, BBC Local Radio, her local area newspaper, and about 20 notable publications in one form or another. And you immediately think, this person has got something. A, enough people have seen something in her to take a chance on it, and B, she's had the initiative to go out and get that stuff at that young age. She will go far. She wasn't, as it turned out, she wasn't an outstanding hit with us, but I probably shouldn't say her name, but she has now got a perfectly good career in the media, and I'm not at all surprised.
Well, what about the other? How would you say, Sally, if you were telling someone this is the way you stand out, this is make your mark? You talk about how difficult it is on a piece of paper, but would you have any advice to how someone might go about doing that?
It is so difficult, isn't it? I mean, lots of people ask me, because I work in sport, is it difficult being a woman in sport? How do you stand out as a woman in sport? That's the question I get asked a lot of the time. So if you don't mind, I'll give this answer, which is that I think it's really important as a woman in sport to completely forget you're a woman in sport. I don't want to be treated any differently to anyone else, and I don't expect anyone else to treat me differently either. So that's the thing I always say to like young women coming through. Just go in expecting the best, expect the best from everybody. Don't wait for, for things to go wrong or for things to be difficult, because at times they will be difficult. But I think always go in and expect the best of people. And the other thing that the people coming through who really stand out to me are the ones who are completely normal with everybody. And by that, I mean, they say hello and smile and chat and remember your name, and we'll have a normal conversation, perhaps not about work. And that's, I think, it's really difficult if you're coming in and trying to prove yourself and there's a lot of pressure on you. I think it's quite important to be able to be relaxed and human with people, because we are all the same. We're not like different because of our jobs. We all started somewhere. We were all really nervous. And actually, I think certainly coming to BBC Breakfast, you are, as a new person coming through or a work experience person, you are very much looked after and welcomed. So that's the thing that I think makes people stand out. Be human. And if you're a bit nervous, say you're a bit nervous, because that's fine too.
Yeah. So Dharmesh, social skills, and maybe when you're on that work experience, or when you've got that opportunity to, don't be scared to ask questions, to want to be busy all the time. Don't just sit there and look at even though it's very easy and it does happen, don't sit and look at your computer screen. Go and make a nuisance of yourself and say, look, I can do this, that, and the other.
Well, I mean, using Sky Sports News as an example, when people come in for work experience, it's normally a 2-week work experience, and they get to experience every aspect of what happens at Sky Sports News. So they might be on the planning desk, they might be on the news desk, they'll go out with the reporter, they'll sit on the presenter's desk, they'll be with the production team. And whenever I've had a work experience person come out with me on a shoot, I always can detect how enthusiastic and how keen they are to get forward, because they might ask me, what kind of questions are you going to ask this manager? And that would happen the night before. So I've had that on a couple of occasions when I thought, right, this is good. So then I put the onus on them and say, why don't you come up with a list of questions that you would want to ask? And then we'll compare them in the morning. And on both occasions, I've actually said, you know what? I didn't even think of that one. I think I'm going to use that. Thanks very much. And then afterwards, I would try and mock up a live for them. So I'd go into my car and phone them. They'd have their phone attached to their ear like they would if their director was talking to them. And I would try and pretend to be the director. And I would say, right, I'm going to ask you the question and I'm going to talk and speak to you like what the director might say to you. So don't be distracted. This is what you're going to have to get into your ear. You're going to have to like learn to have a conversation happening in here and still do your job. So on those occasions, I noticed that when I said something to them, oh, we're on picture, for example, they were on a float of a picture or a goal or something, they would stop talking. And then they would then realize, gosh, that was really off-putting. And one of the tips that I was given was to get used to that voice in your ear is like you're out for dinner, you're having a conversation with the person you're out for dinner at, but you're having more than an active interest in the conversation on the next table without it distracting you from what you're talking about at dinner. It's not easy, but you get used to it.
You're all at the top of your game now, and you've all made it in sports journalism. Was there ever a time when you were starting out where you thought, I'm a bit nervous about specializing in sports journalism because it really narrows down my opportunities? I'll start with you, Nick, on that one.
I didn't particularly, I think I'm a bit like Sally again here, I didn't particularly set out to do that. In both of my first two jobs at Pennine Radio and at Yorkshire TV, I was employed as a news reporter, presenter. And because I knew about sport, I got given the sports stories. And then because I seemed to do those okay, the sports team at both places said, actually, we could make use of you. So I worked almost as a almost like a freelance, sort of separately, in addition to my normal working week, for the sports desk for both organizations. And then when I went to, but I still carried on, I would say the majority of my work was still news rather than sport, all the way through my work at both those places. And when I went to Sky, the reason I moved was I wanted to have more production strings to my bow. Goes back to what somebody said earlier about the more things you can do, the better. I applied for a news producer's job. It was an overnight, it was working on the breakfast program, which is then called Sunrise. And I did the shadow shift overnight. At the end of a 12-hour shift, I sat down in the broom cupboard that passed for the deputy head of news's office, an Australian guy called Mike Nolan. And they were clearly they minded to offer me the job. And Mike Nolan said, "My only worry about you, mate," except he said in an Australian accent, but
I said you weren't going to speak German tonight.
is that in 6 months' time, you'll miss live broadcasting. You'll be knocking on my door wanting to go on screen. I said, I don't know. I said, I'm really, really serious about producing. That's why I'm moving. I've done producing at Yorkshire, but there's no job for me there. I'm serious about it, but I don't know. If I do knock on your door in 6 months, what are you going to say? And he looked at me and said, "Shave the beard off, mate." Which, as it happened, I did, because my then fiance decided she didn't like it anymore. And as it happened, a job did come up 9 months after I arrived at Sky as the producer presenter on the old Sky News sports desk, and I got that. And that was my first job. So after 14 years in journalism, 15 years in journalism, that was my first all sports job, but then I've never left.
What about you, Dharmesh? It's something you've always wanted to do, so I guess it wasn't an issue to you.
Yeah, it was always sports reporting for me. And if it wasn't sports reporting, it would have been a different career, I think. I mean, the things I was thinking about then was, if sports journalism didn't work out, I was even thinking a maths teacher was the next in line, I think. But I've always wanted to do sports reporting. So it was that, or that's why I gave myself that 1 year, because I knew if I didn't get it in that 1 year, or feel I was getting anywhere in that 1 year, then I'd say, right, look, I didn't, when I'm 47 and bald, I wouldn't have to look back and say, what if? So
yeah. And Sally, I guess you did have the option, because you started out essentially reporting news as a news reporter, didn't you?
Yeah, do you know what? I don't think I ever really did have an option. I think lots of things happened to me that it was just kind of timing or fluke. I started out in news for probably my first 5 years of my career were news. And then I did the cheeky little 6-week sport fill-in. And, but I had already done quite a bit of sport reporting, because same as Nick, really, you know, I was interested in sport. So I would always talk to the sports journalist about what was going on, and they go, "Oh, she's quite interested. She knows what she's talking about." And I'd end up doing sport pieces. And yeah, I've kind of gone between the two. I did, you know, sport for a number of years locally, and then I did a job in the north of England working for Network as like a northern sports reporter, covering, because it was at the time when all the northern clubs were there was a massive resurgence. It was really, I think it was basically because David Beckham had moved to Cheshire, and, you know, Posh Spice was around a lot, and they wanted lots and lots of David Beckham stories. Anyway, it kept me in a job for 2 years. And then, yeah, when I moved to London, I moved into the news pool in the BBC newsroom down there, which was brilliant, amazing place to work. And I didn't ever consciously think I must get back to sport or I must do this. I just always, I pitched sports stories as much as I pitched news stories. And then if there was a tournament coming up, I'd start to pitch more, and I'd have ideas for things, and they would take them, and then I'd ask to go. You know, I love a tournament. I love a sports trip. I love that thing where you go off and you're in that bubble for 4 weeks or whatever it is. And so I just always kind of flitted between the two until I got offered the job as the sports presenter on BBC Breakfast, and that's literally laced up my trainers and ran up the M6.
Steve, I think it's really good if you can combine a genuine passion for sport and being what I'd call a proper journalist, whether it's a news journalist or not specifically. that's a good combination.
No, I think you're right.
Agreed.
We'll come on to all the great stuff that you're all doing at the moment. But I just wondered, one last question about starting off and career choices. What would you say to people? Because I often say people come and ask me about whether they should aspire to be in front of the camera or behind camera. Now, all of you obviously appear in front of camera, and would be a great loss if you weren't there, of course. But you are at the whim of some strange decisions sometimes, or not maybe you individually, but there are people who, you know, just disappear for no other good reason than somebody's wife or somebody's husband doesn't like the look of them. So what would you say to people who are starting off and who think they want to be in front of camera, but would you explain those pitfalls, or would you say go for it? If you've got it, you'll be fine.
Should I go? I think that this has happened to me a number of times actually, where you know, you probably would look at my career from the outside and think it's all been quite easy. Well, you know, the BBC has tried to make me redundant once because on a whim, the person who took over my department, you know, same thing, just didn't really want me in the department. You know, I managed to kind of, actually what I ended up doing was I ended up going to a World Cup and doing such a great job that they had to keep me. And I think that, you know, I've been rejected again and again and again. I get rejected every day. You know, I've knocked on every door in BBC Sport and been rejected every time. And I think I'm not a particularly thick-skinned person. You know, it's hard. It's really, really hard. But honestly, I think that all those rejections have done me no harm whatsoever, because what I've done is I've found a way around it, and I've followed things that I'm interested in, and I found my own version of success. It might not be the success that I had my heart set on. You know, I'm never going to present Match of the Day or Football Focus or any of those big shows, but I don't really mind that because I'm doing something that I really enjoy. And that's because I found it myself. So what I would say is to people starting out, I think it's really important to not be knocked back by a knockback. Do not be put off because someone doesn't like you, doesn't like your face, your voice, your whatever. I know I've had experiences in the past when I was first starting out in network news where they'd make me re-record the voice track because I sounded too northern. Now that would never, ever happen now. But you just have to kind of like shrug your shoulders and think, oh, right, whatever next, and go again and go again and go again. And, you know, when you're starting off, you get rejections. Now, I'm sure everyone here, you know, all of us get rejected all the time. It's just part of it.
Absolutely. I mean, and you speak to the most successful people in our industry, and even they will tell you that, you know, the job that they're doing now, they weren't necessarily the first choice for it. So it's just the way it happens. Dharmesh, you've seen it from both sides, and you've ended up in front of camera. Are you glad you went that way?
Well, I would say everything Sally said, number one, but also because I've gone through that route, I'm so glad that I did now, because I went to Sky Sports News and I wanted to be a reporter. I went for an interview thinking it was for a reporter. And when I didn't get that and it was a sub-editor and I did that job, I completely understood the other side of what goes into the production of the program and the issues that they're going to have when I started going out on the road and doing reporting. So I would say even if you have the ambition to go straight in and you're lucky enough to just someone picks you out and said, yes, you're on, get on screen, it doesn't often happen. So once your foot's in the door, like I said, learn every aspect of what goes into, for example, at Sky Sports News, what goes into making that 1 hour of television. So what the reporter does, what the camera person does, what the producers, what the sub-editors do, how the job is initially brought forward by the planning team, by the news desk. Because once you have a better understanding of all of that, I think that I became a better reporter because I started on the production side first of all.
Nick?
I completely echo what Dharmesh said there and what Sally said. I'd say three things. I should have mentioned it before talking about lucky breaks, because I also started when I went to TV. I was off screen. I went as a producer to Yorkshire TV, and I'd been there maybe a year, probably less than that, when the esteemed Robert Hall, ex-ITN, ex-BBC, but also ex-Yorkshire, not completely untypically, hadn't quite arrived in time to do the 9:55 a.m. bulletin. And the news editor looked around the newsroom and said, "Hey, you've done radio, you go and do it." So I had absolutely zero preparation or training. This is genuinely truthful. I'm still waiting for anyone to tell me how to present. I don't think I've ever had, I really don't think I've ever had a word of advice from anybody. Might have been quite useful if I had. When I moved to Sky, that was, Sally said, and you said, Steve, it's a kind of, you are at the whim of people. It can be very subjective, and that is why I wanted to get some production experience. Especially, I thought I'd been at Yorkshire 10 years. If the editor changes, I've been in the same place 10 years. If somebody comes in, doesn't like me, you try and move from a position of weakness rather than a position of strength, because you've lost your on-screen job. That's quite a bad position to be in. So if I had some proper production experience, that would be good. So that's why I moved to Sky, to give myself that extra string to the bow. And the third thing I'd say is, if you think you want to be on screen, this is what I always say to people who approach me, I want to be on the telly. I always say, why? Why do you want to be on telly? What is it about the job that appeals to you? And if it's anything to do with being famous, that's not a very good reason.
No, that's the end of it. That's the end of it. Very short conversation. Right. Some of the questions coming in. Jude Aston is asking, how do you build up a relationship with your sources to get whatever info you need out of them? I guess, let me come to you, Sally, first, because you've had just this amazing last 12 months, particularly with Marcus Rashford and the free school meals campaign, which changed government policy. I mean, it's just been a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant campaign. But perhaps it'd be quite interesting to know how that all began, and how you have to build a relationship with someone like Marcus to get the impact that you did.
It began with good old-fashioned proper journalism. It began because our brilliant planning editor, Liam Blythe, was sitting on the planning desk one day and happened to spot something. He'd spotted something like I think there was a school in Manchester that was for children who were hard of hearing, and they'd been running a competition, and Marcus had responded to them on one of the social media platforms. And Liam said, "This is quite nice, isn't it? Footballers don't very often get involved in this sort of thing. Isn't that might be quite interesting?" And he spoke to myself and my brilliant producer, Claire Ryan. And this is the other thing to mention, you see me on the telly, I don't do this on my own. In recent years, I've been working very closely with a producer, and that's the reason that we have managed to do so well. Claire and I spoke about it, decided to approach him, and were quite surprised, pleasantly surprised, when he agreed to talk to us about this poetry competition. And it just seemed like one of those really nice stories that a positive story about a footballer. You don't very often hear that sort of thing. And when we went to do the interview with him at his house, it emerged that actually it wasn't just him going, "Oh yeah, this is really nice." He was actually genuinely interested in literacy of all kinds, interested in children's welfare, interested in children who were perhaps having a difficult time, because he was so aware of the situation that they might be in, because it related to tough times that he had as a kid. So we just did this very straightforward piece. He and I sat there, we got a sign language teacher in, we learned some sign language, and the plan was we were going to judge this competition. The entries were incredible, and he was really moved by some of them. They were incredible. And the whole idea was that there would be a conclusion to this, which I won't reveal because we haven't done it yet, but there would be a conclusion to this. And then, of course, there was a global pandemic and everything had to stop. Marcus was injured at the time, and I think had spent a little bit of time. He had time to think, and he couldn't do anything. So he had time to think about what was important to him, what his values were, how to be useful. And interestingly, we had spoken about free school meals. He'd mentioned the importance of free school meals during one of our chats about the competition that we were doing, relating back to him how important the Breakfast Club had been to him, how important the books and the library had been to him, how he remembered really clearly the big effect that had had on his life and gave him some routine and stability. And and he decided to write a letter to the Prime Minister about it. And we knew it was coming. And there was a moment, I suppose, when things changed, which was he had to decide whether he wanted to talk about this on television, because it's all very well to write your letter and write down your thoughts and then check it and check you've said everything you want to say and then check it again. But I think to speak without notes about something so personal on the telly was quite a big deal, because he's only young, remember? And incredibly, he agreed to do it. It was a Sunday afternoon. I went round to his house, sat in the garden. There's that shot that they use all the time, sitting on his garden wall, by that point 2 meters apart. And I got the phone call to say he could do it, get round there. We did it. And I think, credit to him, it was quite a big moment, because he was putting his head above the parapet. And I can remember saying to him, you might get some grief for this, people might not agree with this. And he just said, that's fine, I'm big enough, that's fine, doesn't matter, I've got to do it. And so I suppose your question is about, how do you build a relationship? I don't think you can go into a situation and think, right, I must build a relationship with this person, because you just can't. You just have to relate to them on a human level, in the way that you would with anyone. Okay, that story is about, a footballer with a really high profile, but I would talk to him the same way that I talk to anybody that I meet. So we just happened to get on really well and developed, I suppose, a trust between us. And every time there was something new to report, or he was going to do something new, we would find out and we would talk to him about it.
And that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, trust is the key in a situation like that. Specifically, trust is the key, isn't it?
Yes, totally. Because it's not my job to tell his story for him. He is the person with the story. I'm not, I don't know what he's going to do next, or what he thinks about what might happen next. It's just my job to go there and find out what he's doing, and then let him tell his story in a way that, everybody then at home can share and see. So trust is really, really important. And also, like, just maybe taking a step back a little bit and just, let it unfold. I don't think at any point we chased him or pushed him or did anything that would, made him, give us an interview. You can't force someone to talk to you. They've got, there's got to be an element of trust on both sides. And I think we established that really quickly, and, it worked really well.
Yeah, it worked absolutely brilliantly, didn't it? It couldn't have worked any better. Dharmesh, you deal with big names as part of your job all the time. How do you manage those sort of relationships, and how difficult is it? Because clearly you're dealing with big names who've got big stories to tell that your audience is fascinated by. But I bet there's half the stuff you're told you don't report on. So you have to pick and choose what you say, and you know how all your contacts are going to react to what you do say publicly.
Wish I'd gone first now. After listening to Sally. Thanks for that. So when I got a reporter's job at Sky Sports News, I remember vividly my boss at the time walked past me, and he just said, by the way, what's your contacts book like? And I went, what? And he said, your contacts book. I said, I don't know, not good. He goes, right, every shoot you go on, I want you to make sure you come back with a number, whoever it is. You just don't know when you're going to need that number again. It's the best piece of advice I've had in the 20 odd years I've been at Sky, because I'll give you an example of why it's so important to do that. I was driving in once on a Sunday afternoon, and the desk called me. I was on my way into the office. I said, don't come to the office, just go to, it was a hotel in central London, and we've set up an interview with Jermaine Easter. I don't know whether you remember Jermaine Easter. He used to play for Plymouth, I think, and I think he was a Wales international. And he was playing in League One at the time. So I said, okay, fine. So I get down to the hotel, and there's Jermaine Easter, and he's with an agent. It's like, League One player's got an agent, right? Okay, fine. So I did the interview, and I kept in mind what my boss had said. So at the end of the interview, I asked Jermaine Easter for his phone number, and the agent interjected and said, no, you can take my number. So I said, all right, fine. So I'm like, how much use is this going to be? How far is this number going to take me? Well, lo and behold, this agent then became involved in various deals like Kolo Toure going from Arsenal to Man City, which when I was interviewing Jermaine Easter would have been the last thing in my mind. Antonio Rudiger going to Chelsea as well. He was involved in these deals. And then you think, right, you build up a trust with someone like that who's well connected. And then sometimes I would call, I remember during this pandemic, actually, I would call him and I would say, do you still deal with Saido Berahino? Because he'd done a podcast where he'd said quite a few things about his time at West Brom and how he was sorry how things had turned out. And he said, I don't deal with him anymore, but I've got the number of the guy who does. So he then calls his friend to expect a call from me. And he says, I trust Dharmesh, don't worry, it'll all be good. And so another good contact comes from that. And then from there, another one, and from there, another one. So
that, yeah, you've just given a perfect illustration of how our sort of journalism works, really. And it's a great illustration of how it all works and how to make it successful. Nick, we're lucky enough to talk to some very high profile people on a regular basis, people who achieve amazing things in sport and are household names and are very rich. Is there ever a time that you can remember that you've been slightly overawed or slightly nervous about talking to a particular A-lister?
I can only think of two. One was when I went to do terrible phrase we use in Germany. I went to interview the Royal Princess Anne in her rooms at Buckingham Palace, and that is a little bit different, and I was a little bit more mindful of my P's and Q's on that occasion. But she was fine, and as they say, put you at your ease. And the other one was it was partly a technical thing. It was a technical thing. It was when I was doing Don King, the very flamboyant boxing promoter, American before the time, I suspect, of most of the people on this call. But he was the last item in a live show. And the thought of, could I get Don King to stop talking before we went off air? That was the heart rate went up a little bit on that. But otherwise, no. It's exactly as Sally said. You try and treat them as normal people. I remember the first time I met Lewis Hamilton, and I tried the usual kind of small talk thing. He was living in Geneva at the time. I said, "How's your French?" And he answered the question, but he wasn't having the small talk. But I'd done my bit. Just to go back down slightly the road that Sally was down, and Dharmesh as well. Really, it is being normal with people and building up their trust. Don't let them down. So, two examples briefly. I was about to interview Arthur Scargill, who, again, before the time of most of you, but he was a major figure as the leader of the miners' union at the time when they had the potential to bring down a government. He wasn't talking to any old person, and I was trying to get an interview with him, and the doubt was, could he trust this guy from the telly? And another left-wing MP, Pat Wall, another Liverpudlian, who had met me a few times, knew that I was straight and said to Arthur Scargill, he's okay. Yeah, it was nothing about my politics, just that I was straight. I wouldn't twist things the wrong way. And last Saturday, to bring things right up to date, Rachel Blackmore off the back of the Grand National, Sky got the first live interview with her after her Grand National win outside those who'd paid for it, the rights holders who of course go first.
ITV, Nick.
ITV, yes, and BBC Radio, Sally. But the first one after that. Why? Because I've built relationships over 20 years with the people who run Aintree and run the Grand National, and they trust me. And I'm just going to expand on that to answer a question that I just think it's important to. It hasn't come up tonight, but using the Aintree theme, I did 3:15 because we had no producer because of COVID restrictions. There are only 2 of us at Aintree this year for Sky. I did 3 15-hour days in a row. I'm still knackered from it. I'm about to enter my 40th year in professional broadcast journalism. I think I've got a fair idea what I'm doing, but you still have to put the hours in. You have to know everything about everything. You have to do it now but until quite recently, when you didn't have the internet in the same way, if I went on holiday, my news agent would keep all the newspapers for me, all the sports pages, and I'd read them all when I go back before I went back to work. It's no good if Kay Burley says to you, but how does this compare with last week, Nick? No good saying, don't know, Kay was on the beach last week. So you have to be, you don't have to be obsessive. You want to be normal. You have to have a life, but you have to work and you have to keep working or you will fall off the perch.
Just very, very quickly, Steve, one thing I always say to myself, and I always check myself on this, is what story is worth risking a relationship over? That's the question I ask myself with any story that I get. So if you've got various contacts that you need to speak to about a certain story and they're not willing to give you that information or tell you don't run it, even if you believe it to be true, you still have to make that, like you said, there's lots of things that we haven't reported when we know that they're true. That's sometimes because in the long run, is it worth running that story?
Absolutely. And it's got to be huge for you to take that decision, hasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And normally the answer is there isn't a story. And not in my experience yet. No,
absolutely. That's really good advice. Look, I know we're coming to the close now. We've got a few more minutes left. So I just want to leave everyone with, well, as I said before, you're all at the top of your game, but I know sometime in your career, something will have gone wrong on air that you might have been embarrassed about or you wish hadn't happened. So I just want to share with everyone, if you could share with everyone your most embarrassing moment to prove that you don't have to be perfect all the time to make it to the big time. Dharmesh, perhaps you start if you've got one that comes to mind.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Yes. How long have you got? 2005 FA Cup final. I knew it was a big deal. It was one of the first massive events that I was sent to, and it was Arsenal against Manchester United, and it was the Millennium Stadium. And I got there on Wednesday. The match was on Saturday, but we were doing lives from Thursday. I think Arsenal were arriving at their hotel on the Thursday, so I was manning the Arsenal hotel, and I was so conscious, do not screw this up, do not screw this up. So I basically tried to memorize every word I was going to say on this live. And so they threw to me, it was at 4 o'clock on a Thursday. And bear in mind, I was there for the whole day. So that from Wednesday all the way into late Thursday afternoon, I'm constantly in my head, don't screw this up. Make sure you've got everything written down. And I just tried to memorize it. And in the middle of that very first live, it just all went out of my head and I was a bumbling wreck. And sometimes when that happens, when you watch it back, it's never as bad as you think. And like a 2-second gap when you're doing a live can feel like 20 seconds. And so I was hoping it was going to be one of those situations, but it wasn't one of those situations. It was really bad, to the point where actually a couple of people from work were texting me saying, you're all right, just try and relax. And it's like, oh, it's so bad.
It's terrible. I'm sure we've all been there with that one though. When your mind goes completely blank. My most embarrassing time was when ITV used to have a news channel, and every hour we used to change the presenters. But because we were quite short-staffed, we used to have to use a foot pedal to make the autocue go round. So we were driving it ourselves. You just put your foot on it and the autocue would start. And the start of every hour, we have this, this big music and the headline sequence. And I was taking over from Mark Austin, who's now at Sky News. And we know each other quite well, and we wind each other up quite a lot. But anyway, so I quit, I was like 30 seconds to go. He quickly got out of his seat. I got into his seat. The big music came up. I pressed my foot on the pedal, and the autocue disappeared because he'd put the button in reverse intentionally. So I just stood there when as you say, 3 or 4 seconds, it feels like half a minute, and I didn't have any scripts or anything like that, and these words just disappeared off the screen thanks to Mark Austin. So Mark, thank you very much. How about you, Sally?
Oh, it's a really similar story, actually, I suppose. I mean, God, there's been so many over the years, and I think, like Dharmesh says, that there's lots of moments where you think, you come off air and you think, oh, I really screwed that up, and then afterwards, I mean, I never watch stuff back, but afterwards you think about it, you think, actually, it was fine. I think it was okay. It wasn't too bad. But I think one of the most wrenchingly, awfully panic-induced moments was so on a Sunday, if you present BBC Breakfast, you do your 3 hours, and then one person goes off and goes to read the news on the Andrew Marr programme. And the last kind of, hour or so of BBC Breakfast is on the news channel, not on BBC One, because Match of the Day is on. So you come off this long broadcast, and then you've got to really be at the top of your game, because right at the top of the Andrew Marr show, there is a news bulletin, and there's generally a really, a couple of massively famous politicians sitting there waiting to be interviewed, and it's very serious, and it's very, very, very grown up. And so it's one of the scariest things you can do is finish this quite nice breakfast and then sit in the chair to read completely new scripts that you haven't seen or written yourself as they come up, and you've got to get the news bulletin. And I remember one Sunday a couple of years ago, I came off air in BBC Breakfast, sat in the different studios, sat down in my place, and I could hear like a little bit of noise outside the studio, everyone laughing, because that moment when the program's finished, everyone relaxes, lots of giggling. And then I saw the lights go out, and then I saw the lights in the gallery go out, and then I saw the autocue die, and someone had completely unplugged the whole gallery and they'd all gone for a break. So I then heard Andrew Marr throw to me for the news bulletin, and I had no autocue, no paper scripts, no nothing. So I knew what the top story was, and it was into a clip. And so I busked the top cue because I'd done it on breakfast. And I then had to do an entire bulletin with no paper scripts or autocue at all. It wasn't my finest hour, I'll be honest.
You got through it though. You honestly
got through it, yeah.
Nick.
1993, I think, Stuttgart. The last year of the old European Cup before the Champions League started. Leeds are away to Stuttgart. It's live on network ITV. Brian Moore is commentating. Ian St. John, God rest his soul, is presenting. I'm the touchline reporter. It's 0-0 at half time. This is a knockout even in the early rounds in those days. Second half, Stuttgart go 3-0 up. 5 minutes from the end, legendary ITV match director Ted Ayling says to me on the touchline, "Can you check with Howard Wilkinson, who's the Leeds manager, a no-nonsense character, much respected and rightly so. Would I go and check with him in the dugout whether he would do a live interview on the final whistle?" I said, "Look, Ted, I know Howard. I work with him a lot. He'll do it. It'll be fine." No, you've got to ask him. We need to know if he's going to do it, because if he isn't, we're going straight to the Manchester United game, which has got 15 minutes to go. I said, okay. So I picked the best possible moment I could, the least awful moment. I approached Howard Wilkinson. I got a 2-word answer ending in off. When I slunk back to my position between the two dugouts, and then as the whistle's about to go, I said to Ted Ayling on talk back, "Do you want me to try Howard again, see if he'll still do it?" And Ted said, "Yeah, if you're prepared to ask him." So why the business of having to ask him in advance, I don't know, because he still wanted me to try it. So I went over to Howard. Without a word, he put his head down and strode towards the camera. Brian Moore threw down to me. I said, "Howard, particularly disappointing night, especially after such a a good first half. I'm more disappointed in you interrupting me. How would you like it if I marched into your studio and you read the news? He did eventually.
Quite right too, though.
And I said, I'm trying to do my job, you're trying to do yours, and then it went cut back to Instant John after that, and Saint's face is an absolute picture, open mouthed, speechless. And there were columns in the Daily Mail.
No.
Some people supporting me. How dare Howard Wilkinson be so rude to that nice Nick Powell, and plenty supporting Howard saying, yeah, outrageous who think the media think they are. So that was an awkward night, and Brian Moore, also no longer with us, was absolutely wonderful in
there you go, wonderful experiences, and we've all survived them, so all's well that ends well, and that's where we've got to leave it tonight, I'm afraid. I know there was so much more I wanted to talk about, I'm sure so much more you wanted to talk about, but we've run out of time. So thank you all for giving up your time to talk us through your life, your careers, giving us your advice, and I hope everyone who's part of this tonight has had a great time and has learned something, and maybe we can all do it again sometime. But thank you very much indeed.
Well done, Steve. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Speak soon.